Okay, hello English 110 students. It's Dr. Vince Fitzgerald. I am your professor for this class. Um, Normally in a face-to-face classroom, we would have lively discussions about the works we're going to read, guided discussions, because I want to make sure that my students kind of get some of the major points going on. So as we go through these readings lectures, meaning as we're going through the readings that we've done, and I'm talking about it, a couple of things. Make sure you take good notes. Now, I might talk fast at times, so you may want to push pause and rewind at times to make sure your notes are pretty thorough. You're going to want to have your notes for the final and also for when you're writing your papers. Also, if we read something aloud in class, make sure that you mark it, okay? That you have some way of saying, okay, this was some of the things that Fitzgerald read aloud in class, because that's going to be important when you are studying for your final. Part of your final is going to be recognizing passages and their significance to the larger whole. And I'm only going to test you on the passages we actually covered in class, we paused over, we talked about as significant. Okay, so you should be looking now at the screen. Maybe you have a hard copy with you as well. Some of you may also have a hard copy of the book. Either way is fine. I do recommend, for the sake of marking up, I do recommend that you print up any of these PDF files. But that's up to you. Start with this short story, a very short story called Araby. It's written by James Joyce, who was a very famous Irish writer of the early 20th century. And we have a story of a boy living in Dublin, perhaps in the 1890s, who is crushing pretty hard, isn't he, on his friend Mangan's sister, who is older than he is. And it's really about the first crush of his life. And so most of us can remember what that was like, how it was very confusing, maybe wonderful, but confusing. And so I wanted to take a look here. So page is 126, how he's thinking about her. He's still a child. He's still playing childish games out in the street with his friends, but when he sees her, things change. So I'm looking at the second paragraph there on page 126. Every morning I lay on the floor in the front parlor watching her door. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash so that I could not be seen. So he's kind of checking her out from behind the sash. When she came out on the doorsteps, my heart leapt. I ran to the hall, seized my books, and followed her. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. Okay, so he's not actually saying anything to her, but he's kind of following her. I remember when I was in high school, if I liked a girl, I would find out where her locker was, and I would just casually be near there when I knew she was going to be near there. Maybe I was too shy to talk to her. Okay, maybe you've had that experience too. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. And then he talks about he would carry her with him, the image of her, to some unusual places. Her image accompanied me, even in places the most hostile to romance. On Saturday evenings, when my aunt went marketing, I had to go to carry some of the parcels. We walked through the flaring streets, jostled by drunken men and bargaining women. Amid the curses of laborers, the shrill litanies of shop boys who stood on guard by barrels of pigs' cheeks, the nasal chanting of street singers sang a "Come All You" about O'Donovan Rossa, or a ballad about the troubles in our native land. So we're supposed to picture this sort of marketplace where lots of people there are sort of jostling around, drunken men, bargaining women. It's not the sort of place that is especially romantic. But he would carry her in his brain, a picture of her in his brain as he went to these places. These noises converged in a single sensation of life for me. I imagined that I bore my chalice safely through a throng of foes. Well, what is that? A chalice is like a cup. If you come from a Catholic tradition, the chalice is the cup that holds the wine that the priest holds up. He thinks of her almost as a chalice. This image of her he's carrying in his head is a chalice that he's carrying safely, like some sort of a knight in shining armor, through a throng of foes. Her name sprang to my lips at moments in strange prayers and praises which I myself did not understand. My eyes were often full of tears. I could not tell why, and at times a flood of my heart seemed to pour itself out into my bosom. So you and I are no longer children. We're no longer the age of that boy. I certainly am not. But maybe you can remember that time, and it's just so strange, and he just so idolizes her, and his eyes are full of tears. He doesn't know why. And it was just, this fled from his heart. So he's crushing super hard, and it's all very confusing to him. But he, we as adults look back at this and say, okay, well, we know he's going to get through it. It won't kill him. And in fact, the fact that it's an adult writing the story, looking back on his childhood, means, okay, somehow he gets through it. But he's crushing hard. If you knew this little boy, you would feel for him, wouldn't you? One evening, I went back into the drawing room in which the priest had died. It was a dark, rainy evening, and there was no sound in the house. But through one of the broken panes, I heard the rain impinge upon the earth, the fine, incessant needles of water playing in the sodden beds. Some distant lamp or lighted window gleamed below me. I was thankful that I could see so little. All my senses seemed to desire to veil themselves, and feeling that I was about to slip from them, I pressed the palms of my hands together until they trembled, murmuring, oh, love, many times. And so we have this sort of confused adoration that he has for her. He adores her. He is almost as if he's praying to the god or goddess of love. And so he's crushing really hard. And then the top of page 127. At last she spoke to me. When she addressed the first words to me, I was so confused that I did not know what to answer. She asked me if I was going to Araby. I forgot whether to answer yes or no. It would be a splendid bazaar, she said. She would love to go. And then it turns out, well, she can't go because she has something to do with her school, which is a convent, is where she's going to school. While she spoke, she turned a silver bracelet round and round her wrist. So I want you to imagine this, okay? He's talking to her, and every little thing she does, every little motion of her body interests him, piques his interest. She could not go, she said, because there would be a retreat that week in her convent. Her brother and the two other boys were fighting for their caps, and I was alone at the railings. Okay, so her brother and the two other boys are playing, where they're grabbing caps and shoving and running around. Exactly the sorts of things our little boy, this unnamed narrator, would be doing if he wasn't talking to Mangan's sister. She held one of the spikes, bowing her head towards me. The light from the lamp opposite our door caught the white curve of her neck, lit up her hair that rested there, and falling, lit up the hand upon the railing. So I want you to picture this, where she's standing there and she's being lit from the side or behind, catching the white curve of her neck, and her hair is all lit up. If you and I were to see that in a Renaissance painting, we would recognize it as a halo. So he's almost seeing her as this angelic figure. Okay, but then look at this. It fell over the side of her dress and caught the white border of a petticoat, just visible as she stood at ease. Now, if you don't know, a petticoat is an undergarment. So if she's wearing a skirt, no doubt a long skirt, okay, the petticoat would be an undergarment that is just peeking a little bit below her skirt. It is the most innocent of undergarments, but still, she would not want it to be seen. She wouldn't want her petticoat to be showing, okay? But notice that he notices it. So just as he's staring up at her as an angel, he's also interested in her, this undergarment, and he's turned on by her, okay? And so she says, "It's well for you," she said. "If I go, I will bring you something." Okay, so he promises to get her something. This is his big chance to impress her, right? Freud would call a moment like this, or what the boy is going through, he might call it a whore Madonna complex, where he sees this woman as this beautiful Madonna, this beautiful angel. He puts her up on this pedestal, and it has all this confused adoration for her. And yet at the same time, her twirling her silver bracelet around her wrist, and the fact that this little piece of her petticoat is showing means he kind of wants to get with her, right? And so this is a sort of confusing sort of moment for him. That is something he sort of needs to work through. Okay. His uncle isn't coming home. He's waiting. He's panicking. He's going to miss the whole Araby. The last maybe 4 or 5 lines of this page 127. I looked over at the dark house where she lived. I may have stood there for an hour, seeing nothing but the brown-clad figure cast by my imagination, touched discreetly by the lamplight at the curved neck, at the hand upon the railings, and at the border below the dress. Okay, so just in case we missed it the first time, Joyce, or Joyce's narrator in this case, repeats it for us. You know, it's all about looking at her, the light on the curved neck, the hand on the railings, the border below her dress. Okay, he's crushing really hard, and he's thinking, you know, what can I do? What could I get her? So he goes to the Araby, and he goes in there. It's already late. Things are kind of closing up, and so at the bottom of page 128. Remembering with difficulty why I had come, I went over to one of the stalls and examined porcelain vases and flowered tea sets. At the door of the stall, a young lady was talking and laughing with 2 young gentlemen. I remarked their English accents and listened vaguely to their conversation. Oh, I never said such a thing. Oh, but you did. Oh, but I didn't. Didn't she say that? Yes, I heard her. Oh, there's a fib. Observing me, the young lady came over and asked me, did I wish to buy anything? The tone of her voice was not encouraging. She seemed to have spoken to me out of a sense of duty. I looked humbly at the great jars that stood like Eastern guards at either side of the dark entrance to the stall and murmured, no, thank you. The young lady changed the position of one of the vases and went back to the 2 young men. They began to talk of the same subject. Once or twice the young lady glanced at me over her shoulder. I lingered before her stall, though I knew my stay was useless. Okay, and it's kind of interesting, that choice of word there, useless. Okay, he knows he's not going to buy anything, but he stayed there long enough, he says, to make my interest in her wares seem the more real. So, I don't know, it could be one of those situations where you walk into a store and instantly you recognize, okay, there's nothing in this store that would possibly interest me. Okay, Dr. Fitzgerald walks into Hot Topic and recognizes instantly, unless I'm shopping for my nephew or something, there's nothing in here for me. Okay, but then I don't want to just immediately pivot and then walk straight out or back out. You know, I might pick up something and turn it over and pretend that I'm kind of interested before I go. But for him, he recognizes that something has changed, he now recognizes the uselessness. Then I turned away slowly and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed 2 pennies to fall against the 6pence in my pocket. He's not going to buy anything. I heard a call up from one end of the gallery that the light was out. The upper part of the hall was now completely dark. It's shutting down, it's closing up time. Whatever this Araby would have been, it would have, you know, whatever sort of the best part of it was over before he even got there, right? Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity. Vanity now means, more exclusively, it means you're vain. In other words, you're too into yourself. You like looking at the mirror and seeing yourself in the mirror. But vanity also means sort of emptiness, the vainness, the hopelessness of something. So now he sees himself as a creature derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. And that's where the story ends. He seems very sad and angry, and his eyes are burning. He's near tears here at the end. And the question is why? What has happened? What is it about this moment that hit him that made him realize that he is a creature driven and derided by vanity? And I think, it might be helpful to go back to the conversation he was listening to. It was sort of an empty conversation. It wasn't, oh, yes, you did. Oh, no, I didn't. I said that. No, you never said that. I never said that. And so maybe, and this is just a perhaps, but maybe it's just sort of the here you're seeing sort of the more grown up, the cool kids, more grown up people talking, a young lady, two young gentlemen talking, and this is what their conversation's about. Sort of this emptiness, and then he just sort of recognizes, he had this great crush on this girl, and maybe ultimately it's just that empty and that sort of nothingness. Okay, I'm just offering that as a possibility. James Joyce in his short stories especially liked to build in something that he called an epiphany. An epiphany here, you might want to write this down. Epiphany, 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 is this sort of sudden recognition, sudden realization. Okay? And it's not always clear in a Joyce story the nature of the epiphany. Okay, what it was about the epiphany that sort of what that was the climax of the story, and it so in this case makes him want to cry. He's sad and angry probably with himself. Okay, but we have essentially this story of a young boy. He is crushing hard, but then what oftentimes happens is that there's a difference between the ideal and the reality, and the conflict is between his ideal for her, okay, where he could bring her as if she's some sort of a holy chalice into a ratty looking market place and protect her. That's sort of his dream, his image of her as this angelic figure with a halo lit from behind. And then he has an image maybe of what reality is, and the conflict, the sort of the contrast between them makes him realize how, silly, foolish, how vain he's been up to this point. Okay, so let's shift now to the other part of the reading that you did, which is from Abkarian and Klotz are the editors of this book, and they have a few things to say about literature. So we're going to skip to that part now. Okay, and so you read this section called "Responding to Literature" and why we read literature. What's the point? What is it that we get out of literature? And I think it does a pretty good job sort of explaining what it is. I mean, part of it is what I love about reading either short stories or novels or going to plays or watching movies, for example, is that I get to live sort of other vicarious lives. I get to go through some of the ups and downs of other people's lives in sort of a safe distance. I get to kind of put on another person's life for a while, see what it's like to be that person for a while, and then to enjoy it, even in a tragedy, to experience sort of the highs and lows of being that person. I wanted to go through some of these literary terms, though, these methods of fiction. Okay, and so get ready to take some notes on these. I'll have a few things to say about each. So first of all, there's tone. Okay, and then it says one of the things most readers first respond to in a short story is tone. So tone for our to define it for ourselves. Because it's like mood, tone is difficult to talk about. It can be defined as an author's implicit attitude towards the characters, the places, the events in the story, and toward the reader of the work. Okay, so part of the tone, we could say it's partly mood. Okay, so in other words, what is the mood of this short story? What does it feel like to be the boy in the short story? And then how are you and I to feel about the boy? Okay, so how are you and I to feel about the boy? Well, you and I, we're not children anymore. Most of us have already been through our first crush, and we can recognize what it's like to be through it. But, just like the boy who grows up to become an adult, presumably it's an adult writing the story looking back on his childhood. We've been in that same position before, most of us. And so we kind of feel, I don't know, do we feel a little bit sorry for him? Do we recognize the irony? We'll say a little bit more about irony in a second, but do we sort of recognize he's taking a lot harder than he needs to? Now, it's no good to tell him, oh, don't worry, this person you think is the love of your life in a couple of years, maybe a couple of months, won't even, be that big a deal anymore. That's just the way that, young crushes go. No, it wouldn't do any good to say that. So I think we could look at him. We sort of, if you and I were looking at him, trying to talk to him in the same room, you and I would exchange eyes, kind of rolling our eyes, saying, you feel for this kid. But you also know it's not going to kill him. He'll get past it. Okay. So really, tone is sort of how are we to feel about the characters, the events? How are you and I to feel about that? What is it that the author does to make sure that we are approaching it? I think if we read this as pure comedy, although there are comic moments, maybe we would miss part of the point. If we read it as tragedy, oh my God, this is a horrible thing that happened to this child, I think we would really be missing the point, wouldn't we? Okay. So how should we feel? Is it cheerful? Is it, how does it feel to be a boy growing up in 1890s Dublin? That's sort of what the question is. Okay, so that's tone. Plot is the series of events, the occurrence. What are the series of events that happen? Okay, and that's what makes up the plot. Now, the plot may or may not come chronologically. Okay, meaning that a plot might start from the earliest point and move all the way through to the last point. If we see a movie, the plot is, well, okay, here's the first scene, and then we move all the way through. Maybe they're all chronological so that each scene comes after the one before and before the one after. Okay, but you can also in a movie have flashbacks, can't you? Where all of a sudden we go back in time. Okay, so the plot is not necessarily, it's a series of events, but it's not necessarily chronological. Okay, I wanted to show you something called Freytag's triangle. Let me jump over there. And okay, so here we are, Freytag's triangle. Gustav Freytag, he was a German living in the 19th century. He was a playwright and a critic, and he's really mostly known for this sort of insight he had about plots. Okay, so I want to make sure that you take this down in your notes, because he said just about every plot, in other words, every short story you've ever read, every novel you've ever read, just about any movie you've ever seen, the plot actually kind of follows in a similar pattern. Okay, and it's called Freytag's triangle. Sometimes it's called Freytag's pyramid, but it pretty much goes this way. Okay, so the shape of the triangle is this. Okay, and you'll notice, I think, first of all, there's sort of a flat line, then there's a diagonal line, and then there's even a sharper diagonal line. And what that represents is time. Okay, so if this is a movie, that's 90 minutes or 2 hours moving from left to right. Okay, and if it's a novel, an 800-page novel or something like that, this is basically sort of the flow of the plot. And the pieces of this triangle could be sort of in different form, but this is basically the shape of just about, let's just make it a romantic comedy, okay? You go to see a romantic comedy, this is basically the shape of the plot of the romantic comedy as it moves in time, okay? So this first flat part is what we call the exposition. And in the exposition, this is how we find out, maybe it's before the two lovers, the two people at the end are going to get married. It's maybe before they meet, it's what their lives were like before they met, or maybe they're going out together. It's just an exposition is kind of setting up who's the characters, who are the characters' best friends, so let's say it's, I don't know, Ben Stiller and Jennifer Aniston, okay? They haven't met yet, but we see what they're like at work, we see what their friends are like, we see what their social life is like, and then boom, all of a sudden they meet, and something though is going to keep them from getting what they want, okay? And that is where we get right about here, my arrow here, right there at that kind of corner there. That's what we call the introduction of the conflict, okay? Think of it this way. Almost always in a film, we'll just keep it as a film, romantic comedy, it's pretty clear what we want as an audience. We want those two to get together and maybe get married at the end, okay? But there's something keeping it from happening, okay? And all plots to a greater or lesser degree, work this way. You cannot have a plot without conflict. I don't know quite what it is, but you and I would not want to go see a movie where Ben Stiller and Jennifer Aniston meet each other in the beginning, and they love each other immediately, and the in-laws, everybody loves each other, and they get married, and they're very happy, and they buy a house, and they have children and dogs and cats, and they just live a wonderful, happy life. You and I would say, this is the most boring movie I've ever seen. I don't want to see this movie. Now, you might think that you and I, in our lives, we have enough conflict, that we don't need to borrow somebody else's conflict, right? I've got conflict in my life. But we want it in our plots. So at that point is the introduction of the conflict. We begin to get a sense of what the characters want and what it is that's keeping them from getting what they want, okay? And conflicts, is helpful to think of them in terms of A versus B, okay? These two kids want to get married, but somebody or something's keeping them from being able to do that, okay? And that's the introduction of the conflict, okay? Then as we move through the movie, we have what is called rising action. That's that diagonal line there. So we keep moving and moving, understanding the conflict better, understanding the nature of the conflict, until the conflict reaches a crescendo, okay, a point at which it cannot go any further or any longer, and we call that point the climax. The climax, okay? And I added the word epiphany here because that's what James Joyce would say. If you were looking for the moment of the epiphany, okay? If you're reading a short story and the major character, protagonist, has an aha moment, a recognition, boom, something now I recognize that I did not recognize before. Now I understand something I didn't understand before, okay? That's an epiphany, okay? And it could be internal, all of a sudden, boom, I think of it. Or it could be external. Somebody walks up, gives me information, and now I know what I didn't know before. Now I recognize what I didn't recognize before. Okay, so climaxes oftentimes come in the form of an epiphany. Not always, but oftentimes it comes in the form of an epiphany. Okay, where somebody now realizes, oh, that's the real villain there. I thought this other person chasing me was the villain, but it turns out that person was trying to help me all along. There's the real villain there. I now recognize the real villain for who they are, okay? And so finally we have the climax, and after that we have what is called falling action. You'll notice the falling action, or at least I've tried to make it in this chart, is a little bit more steep than the rising action, because you wouldn't want a movie in which the climax happens in the first half hour, and then after that it's all just sort of, okay, everybody, let's have the wedding and say goodbye and, go off and everything's wonderful. The climax usually comes more towards the end of the movie than towards the beginning of the movie, okay? And sometimes the climax comes very much, maybe with just minutes left in the movie. This is very typical of that happening, okay? And so then we have falling action, and falling action is, okay, how do we put the pieces back together of what's left now that, I don't know, whatever it was that was keeping the lovers from marrying, whatever it was that was keeping them apart, now that's put past them, and now we have falling action. That would be the wedding. That would be, the recognizing that everything is going to be okay. And then finally, at the end, we have what's called the resolution. Okay, and some people leave this off of Freytag's triangle, or some people give it a little bit more space. Some people call it the denouement. Okay, but the resolution is simply tying up of loose strings at the end. The couple go off together on their honeymoon, and last thing you know, that the maid of honor the maid of honor and the head groomsman or the best man are now into each other, and so the story kind of ends with those two kissing. So tying up of loose strings. Okay, that's what the resolution is. What is life going to be like from here on out? Okay, so make sure you have this in your notes, Freytag's triangle. It's helpful to kind of understand. And it's interesting to think, just about every movie I've ever seen, whether it's an action movie, a romantic comedy movie, a drama, or a murder mystery, they all come in this form. Well, one way or another, they have this type of form. Okay, let's go back to the other methods of fiction. Okay, and we're back. So we talked about tone, we talked about plot. Characterization. You have to have characters. Even if they're not human characters, you have to have characters. Okay? It could be a single character, it could be animal characters, it could be aliens, okay? But you have to have characters for there to be literature, for there to be fiction, okay? Now, let's say you went to see a play and the curtain goes up and there's a person sitting in a chair and he's staring out at you. He's just looking out at the audience. You're sitting there and you're waiting for something to happen. He's just sitting in a chair looking at you as you're looking at him. And then 2 hours later, the curtain drops and everybody claps, and that was it. Okay. Was that literature? Well, you might say it wasn't a very good play. It seemed kind of boring, and you're not quite sure of the point. It seemed, if anything, maybe it was a little bit avant-garde, which would be okay. But what was sort of the point of the play? Well, it may not be much of a play, but let me offer you the alternative. The curtain goes up and it's just an empty chair, and you're staring at that empty chair for 2 hours, and then the curtain drops, right? Okay, well, clearly the second one, it doesn't have characters, unless you want to say that chair is a character, okay? But it doesn't have characters, so therefore it's really not fiction. I think the passage talks about two what are called round characters and flat characters. That's sort of worth knowing too, that a round character is one who is able to change, is one who is sort of a fully three-dimensional person who is capable of changing, capable of learning, capable of becoming a better person. Whereas flat characters tend not to. Flat characters oftentimes are background characters. Okay, so if we're going back to that romantic comedy, and I mentioned the maid of honor and the best man, maybe in the end, those are the two. Probably they might be flat characters, the ones who don't really change. They're always the one who sort of have the same attitude. Or maybe the bride has a wacky friend who doesn't change. She's always the same throughout the movie. Okay, we call those flat characters. Not that that's a bad thing. We need secondary characters too. But round characters evolve, they change. Flat characters don't, they remain the same. Okay, moving on. Setting. Setting's pretty easy. Setting is just the time, place, and situation. Okay, so to go back to Araby, the setting is Dublin, perhaps in the 1890s, and the situation is this boy is living in this neighborhood, where different children live that he hangs out with, and of course Mangan's sister's there too. Point of view. There are three different types of narrators. When we're talking about point of view, we're talking about narrators. Okay, and in short stories, in poems, and in novels, maybe not in drama, but in short stories, poetry, and novels, you have a narrator. There's no escaping it. Narrator is the person who's telling you the story. Okay. And we have three different types of narrators. We have what are called first-person narrators. And you know that a first-person narrator, you know you're dealing with a first-person narrator if you see the words I or me or my. Okay? That means that the person telling the story is part of the story. I did this, I saw that. Okay? So we only get the perspective of what's going on in the brain and the heart of a character, and that character is a character in the story or novel. So in the case of Araby, you hear I and me, and it's talking about what this now grown-up man went through when he was, a young child. Well, not such a young child, but a child. Okay? So that's how you know you're dealing with that. And it has its limitations. He can't tell us what Mangan's sister was thinking, for example, because he doesn't have access to Mangan's sister's thoughts. Okay? Then we have third person. We have two types of third person. Okay? There's no such thing as second person narrations. But there's two types of third person narrators. And one of them is called third person omniscient. And the other one is called third person limited. So it's omniscient and limited. The article calls it limited omniscient. But we'll just call it limited for the class, okay? An omniscient narrator knows the hearts and minds of any and all characters that the narrator chooses to. Omniscient simply means all-knowing. Okay, so if the omniscient narrator wants to tell us how many hairs are growing out of a person's, a particular person's head, or how many freckles she has on her nose, an omniscient narrator can tell you that. But an omniscient narrator can also decide not to tell you something or pretend not to know something. So two characters go in a room and the door closes behind them. And the narrator can say, what was said behind that closed door, I do not know. But so an omniscient narrator is all-knowing, or is potentially all-knowing, has access to any information, especially the hearts and minds of any characters, okay? Can tell us what anybody was thinking, what anybody was feeling, but also can limit that omniscience, can limit that power, okay? Now, a third-person limited narrator generally can tell us only the thoughts and feelings of one character. It's not a first-person narrator, because the limited omniscient narrator, the third-person narrators, are not part of the story. They're not there when the story happens, okay? They're telling us about a story, but they're not participants in the story. So third-person omniscient is not a participant in the story, and a third-person limited is also not a participant in the story. So third-person limited, third-person limited and third-person omniscient, again, they are not characters in the story, and an omniscient narrator can tell us the thoughts and feelings of any character, and a limited narrator, third-person limited narrator, can only tell us the thoughts and feelings of one character. Okay? Irony. Irony is a word that's oftentimes misused. Okay? That a lot of people think that irony, they confuse irony with, say, for example, coincidence. Oh, it was ironic you just walked up right now because we were just talking about you. That's not ironic. It might be a coincidence, okay, but it's not ironic. Irony really is the difference between what we expect and what we get, okay, oftentimes what we get, and when those two things don't match, okay. So it would be ironic if the National Meteorologist Society had a picnic and it rained, okay, so that would be irony. Okay, and so oftentimes, in the case of Araby, for example, you and I have sort of an ironic view on the boy. We hear how hard he is taking it, how hard he is crushing. Okay, you and I know that it's not as serious as the boy takes it. He just doesn't know it yet. Okay, but he's crushing pretty hard, but we know he's going to get over it. It's not as catastrophic as he thinks. Okay, and then finally, theme. So theme here is defined as an underlying idea, a statement that a work makes about its subject. Okay, a theme can be a concept. Okay, so it could be about, let's say in the boy's case, crushing or unrequited love, where you love somebody when they don't love you back and they kind of barely know you exist. Okay, so that would be a theme. A theme could be justice. A theme could be injustice. A theme could be the power of determination to overcome obstacles. Okay, those are all themes. But a theme can also be a message. Okay, and so maybe the theme of a message of a romantic comedy could be that even though love can be difficult at times, it is ultimately worthwhile. You know, love can cause pain, but the joy it brings us is worth the pain we have to pay or we have to feel. Okay, so that would be more in terms of a message. So a theme can be a message, but it doesn't have to be a message. It's just an idea, a recurring idea that seems significant to the text as a whole. Okay? All right, well, those are the 7 themes of literature. Try to have an idea, because you might be hearing me use these terms as we're going along. This idea of theme is going to be important for some of the papers you're going to write. I will also say the idea of conflict as we brought it up in plot, a plot conflict, okay, or the central conflict of the plot is going to be very important for your first paper. So make sure that you're pretty clear on that too. Okay, hey, thank you guys very much. This is the first of many lectures. The next thing you're going to be doing is to be taking a quiz, okay, on Araby, the short story, and this lecture, okay? So good luck with that. Take care. Bye now.